This segment covers the adoption of regulations by the United States to address the problem of acid rain, of acid rain in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which is generally regarded as a significant success in dealing with an environmental problem, and it could serve as an important precedent for the issue of climate change. Okay, this is a headline from the Washington Post, November 16th, 1990. Bush, meaning George H.W. Bush, signed sweeping air pollution control into laws. So the question we need to ask ourselves here is, how do you solve or at least seriously address a problem like acid rain? And how can that help us understand how to deal with the problem of climate change? One thing to keep in mind as we talk through this is a concept called policy streams and policy windows. This was articulated by John W. Kingdon in a book called Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policy that was first published in 1984. He says agenda setting is pretty simple if you think about it. If you want a policy window to open, if you want the opportunity to address a big policy problem, you need three streams to interact with each other. One is the policy stream. There has to be some sort of available policy instrument to deal with the problem at hand. There has to be a problem stream. The problem stream means that the public is cued into what the problem is. You can see the phrase focusing event here. We talked about the impact of focusing events on public opinion. But you also have the political stream. The politics need to be right, that perhaps an election has just happened or a politician has committed themselves to dealing with this issue. But Kingdon's insight is basically that unless you have the policy, the problem, and the politics overlapping, you won't have a policy window open up to deal with a problem. Okay. Now, talking about the problem of acid rain. Acid rain is created by emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. This is created largely by the burning of coal, or certain types of coal, without using particular types of technology. This became an increasing problem from the 1960s to the 1980s because factories trying to deal with the problem of local air pollution kept building their smokestacks bigger and bigger and bigger. That's basically passing the problem to somebody else. So many of these factories in Ohio were burning coal, and they were building higher and higher smokestacks, and that resulted in acid rain being transferred to the northeastern United States and to eastern Canada. So it became a particular dispute between the United States and Canada in the 1980s. What does acid rain do? You could take a moment and read this slide here. Basically what this is telling us is that if you go swimming in a lake that has been saturated with acid rain, for example, your skin is not going to burn. There's not going to be some sort of direct impact on you. But what acid rain does is contribute to particulate air pollution, which has been linked with lung inflammation, problems like asthma and emphysema. So there are some indirect but significant impacts on human health. There are other impacts on the natural environment as well. This is a picture in the upper left-hand corner here of a forest that's been depleted by acid rain. This was common in Northern Europe as well in the 1980s. Acid rain has a particular impact on monuments and carvings that are made of stone. You can see this statue here has been degraded by this. Another big impact it has is on fishing. That when acid rain saturates bodies of water, it tends to kill the fish. So in addition to the public health concerns to humans, there's all sorts of other negative externalities in the environment of acid rain. And as I said before, acid rain was a serious U.S.-Canadian policy dispute in the 1980s, and honestly we did not have many policy disputes with Canada during this period of time, nor have we, frankly, since the War of 1812. So this was one major issue that was a dispute between the United States and Canada. This is a headline from the Philadelphia Inquirer from 1988, and it briefly says that the Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was going to visit Reagan towards the end of Reagan's presidency to try yet again to persuade him to deal seriously with the issue of acid rain, and Mulroney and his people were not expecting any miracles in that regard. This is an interesting quote from Mulroney. that was given in 2011, well after his premiership had ended. The acid rain issue was the seminal test of the U.S.-Canada relationship at a time when the environment was coming into its own, meaning as a policy issue. The Americans were reluctant to do something about it because they didn't believe all the science we had available to us, showing that emissions from U.S. Midwest, which floated over Canada, were killing off our lakes, forests, and streams. So I set out to try to persuade them of that. President Reagan agreed to appoint envoys and began the process that led, 4.5 years later, to President Bush signing the Canada-U.S. Acid Rain Treaty. There were unrelenting efforts on the part of my government to persuade him and his administration to move this file along. Now, in 1988, George H.W. Bush was running for president. And something that's important to know is that Bush was Reagan's vice president for 8 years. And one of the challenges when you serve as vice president for 8 years and you're running against, you're kind of running on the record of your predecessor, lots of times vice presidents feel pressure to distinguish themselves in some way from their predecessor. One way Bush decided to do that was to take up environmental causes. Reagan had a reputation for not being a particularly strong president when it came to environmental protection. He was reluctant to deal with the problem of acid rain because of the potential cost to American industry, to adopt technology to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions from plants. But Bush explicitly said, "I am campaigning as the environmental president" in 1988. Partly that's to deflect criticism from his Democratic opponent, who in that election was Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. But Bush wanted to get something done. So he said, "I'm going to be the environmental president, and we're going to deal with the problem of acid rain," the implication being that President Reagan had not done so for 8 years. But how do you address a problem like acid rain? There's basically 4 options. One is simply to stop polluting, which is untenable for all sorts of reasons, most likely. Number 2 is to promote command and control regulation, like we talked about last week in terms of hazardous waste and water pollution. You tell a company that you must adopt this technology or you pay a fine. And smokestacks can be installed with scrubbers that remove some of the worst impacts of sulfur dioxide emissions, for example. Another option is emissions trading, where you create a market where pollution becomes a tradable commodity. And this goes along with the thinking of Ronald Coase. Or you could have a tax on pollution emissions. We're having a debate right now around the world about the utility of carbon taxes to deal with the problem of climate change, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I would ask you to take the time to watch the video One Sakai from the Environmental Defense Fund that explains how a cap and trade system works. It's relatively simple. The Environmental Defense Fund proposed an emission trading system. The Environmental Defense Fund first became famous. They were the environmental NGO that campaigned to get rid of those foam containers for cheeseburgers and hamburgers at McDonald's in the early 1980s. Most of you are probably too young to remember those, but when I was a kid, when you went to McDonald's, you got this gigantic foam case for a cheeseburger. So they led the campaign to get rid of those. So they proposed a cap and trade system for dealing with the problem of acid rain. So this worked out rather nicely in terms of the policy streams concept. And why is that? First of all, you have the public is concerned about this issue, as you saw in the video of the little kid one Saturday morning asking why the government wasn't doing anything about acid rain. You had a new president who was just elected, who was politically committed, and you had a new available policy instrument that was market-based, and that was appealing to a Republican president like Bush. So, the policy stream, the existence of a cap and trade system that was a viable alternative. The problem stream, you had the public keyed into the problem of acid rain, both in the United States and in Canada. And the politics stream, you had a new president who had the political will to get something done in their first year in office. This led to the passage of the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, which instituted a cap and trade system for sulfur dioxide emissions, which still exists and by every measure has been a significant success.